Welcome everyone from Oxford University. I'm on my way to Pembroke College, where Archie Collingwood was fellow, and he's one of the most representatives of British idealism. I'm going to read from his essay, The Idea of History. And if you haven't heard of Collingwood yet, or of this particular essay, I'd recommend you get a copy of it. I'll link to the book that I'm reading from, and it's a crucial essay. I'll keep it brief because it shows us how contingent historical events and conditions are possible at the same time as human freedom, so that they are not mutually exclusive at all. So I hope that you would learn something from this essay if you haven't heard from it yet, and even if you have, perhaps. So thank you very much for listening, and if you can, please do support my work here on this channel. There's plenty of links in the description of this video to do so. Thank you very much indeed.
So, as promised, here is History and Freedom, which you can find in The Idea of Freedom. We study history, I have maintained, in order to attain self-knowledge. By way of illustrating this thesis, I shall try to show how our knowledge that human activity is free has been attained only through our discovery of history. In my historical sketch of the idea of history, I've tried to show how history has at last escaped from a state of pupillage to natural science. The disappearance of historical naturalism, however, entails the further conclusion that the activity by which man builds his own constantly changing historical world is a free activity. There are no forces other than this activity which control it or modify it or compel it to behave in this way or in that, to build one kind of world rather than another. This does not mean that man is always free to do what he pleases. All men, at some moments in their lives, are free to do what they want, to eat, being hungry, for example, or to sleep, being tired. But this has nothing to do with the problem to which I have referred. Eating and sleeping are animal activities pursued under the compulsion of animal appetite. With animal appetites and their gratification or frustration, history is not concerned. It makes no difference to the historian, as an historian, that there should be no food in a poor man's house, though it may and must make a difference to him as a man with feelings for his fellow creatures. And though, as an historian, he may be intensely concerned with the shifts by which other men have contrived to bring about this state of things in order that they should be rich, and the men who take wages from them poor, and equally concerned with the action to which the poor man may be led, not by the fact of his children's unsatisfied hunger, the physiological fact of empty bellies and wizened limbs, but by his thought of that fact. Nor does it mean that man is free to do what he chooses. That in the realm of history proper, as distinct from that of animal appetite, people are free to plan their own actions as they think fit and execute their plans, each doing what he set out to do, and each assuming full responsibility for the consequences, captain of his soul and all that. Nothing could be more false. Henley's rhyme does no more than utter the fantasy of a sick child who has discovered that he has got it. A healthy man knows that the empty space in front of him, which he proposes to fill up with activities for which he accordingly now begins making plans, will be very far from empty by the time he steps into it. It will be crowded with other people all pursuing activities of their own. Even now it is not as empty as it looks. It is filled with a saturated solution of activity on the point of beginning to crystallize out. There will be no room left to his own activity, unless he can do so design this that it will fit into the interstices of the rest. The rational activity which historians have to study is never free from compulsion. the compulsion to face the facts of its own situation. The more rational it is, the more completely it undergoes this compulsion. To be rational is to think, and for a man who proposes to act, the thing that it is important to think about is the situation in which he stands. With regard to this situation, he is not free at all. It is what it is, and neither he nor anyone else can ever change that. For though the situation consists altogether of thoughts, his own and other people's, it cannot be changed by a change of mind on the part of himself or anyone else. If minds change as they do, this merely means that with the lapse of time, a new situation has arisen. For a man about to act, the situation is his master, his oracle, his guard. Whether his action is to prove successful or not depends on whether he grasps the situation rightly or not. If he is a wise man, it is not until he has consulted his oracle, done everything in his power to find out what the situation is, that he will make even the most trivial plan. And if he neglects the situation will not neglect him. It is not one of those gods that leave an insult unpunished. The freedom that there is in history consists in the fact that this compulsion is imposed upon the activity of human reason not by anything else, but by itself. The situation, its master, oracle, and guard, is a situation it has itself created. And when I say this, I do not mean that the situation in which one man finds himself exists only because other men have created it by a rational activity, not different in any kind from that by which their successor finds himself to be in it and acts in it according to his lights, and that, because human reason is always human reason, whatever may be the name of the human being in whom it works, the historian can ignore these personal distinctions and say that human reason has created the situation in which it finds itself. I mean something rather different from that. All history is the history of thought. And when a historian says that a man is in a certain situation, this is the same as saying that he thinks he is in this situation. The hard facts of the situation, which it is so important for him to face, are the hard facts of the way in which he conceives the situation. If the reason why it is hard for a man to cross the mountains is because he is frightened of the devils in them, it is folly for the historian, preaching at him across a gulf of centuries, to say, "This is sheer superstition. There are no devils at all. Face facts and realize there are no dangers in the mountains except rocks and water and snow, wolves perhaps, and bad men perhaps, but no devils." The historian says that these are the facts because that is the way in which he has been taught to think. But the devil-fearer says that the presence of devils is a fact, because that is the way in which he has been taught to think. The historian thinks it a wrong way, but wrong ways of thinking are just as much historical facts as right ones, and no less than they determine the situation, always a thought situation, in which the man who shares them is placed. The hardness of the fact consists in the man's inability to think of his situation otherwise. The compulsion which the devil-haunted mountains exercise on the man who would cross them consists in the fact that he cannot help believing in the devils. Sheer superstition, no doubt, but this superstition is a fact, and the crucial fact in the situation we are considering. The man who suffers from it when he tries to cross the mountains is not suffering merely for the sins of his fathers who taught him to believe in devils, if that is a sin. He is suffering because he has accepted the belief, because he has shared the sin. If the modern historian believes that there are no devils in the mountains, that too is only a belief he has accepted in precisely the same way. The discovery that the men whose actions he studies are in this sense free is a discovery which every historian makes as soon as he arrives at a scientific mastery of his own subject. When that happens, the historian discovers his own freedom. That is, he discovers the autonomous character of historical thought, its power to solve its own problems for itself by its own methods. He discovers how unnecessary it is, and how impossible it is for him, as historian, to hand these problems over for solution to natural science. He discovers that in his capacity as historian he both can and must solve them for himself. It is simultaneously with this discovery of his own freedom as historian that he discovers the freedom of man as an historical agent. Historical thought about the rational activity, is free from the domination of natural science, and the rational activity is free from the domination of nature. The intimacy of the connection between these two discoveries might be expressed by saying that they are the same thing in different words. It might be said that to describe the rational activity of an historical agent as free is only a roundabout and disguised way of saying that history is an autonomous science. Or it might be said that to describe history as an autonomous science is only a disguised way of saying that it is the science which studies free activity. For myself, I should welcome either of these two statements as providing evidence that the person who made it had seen far enough into the nature of history to have discovered a. that historical thought is free from the domination of natural science and is an autonomous science, b. that rational action is free from the domination of nature and builds its own world of human affairs, res geste, at its own bidding and in its own way, c. that there is an intimate connection between these two propositions. But at the same time I should find in either statement evidence that the person who made it was unable, or for some ulterior purpose had decided to profess himself unable, to distinguish between what a person says and what it is implied in what he says. Unable, that is, to distinguish a theory of language or aesthetics from the theory of thought or logic, and was therefore committed, for the time being at least, to a verbalistic logic in which the logical connection between two thoughts which imply each other is confused with the linguistic connection between two sets of words which stand for the same thing. I should see, too, that his attempt to bark the problems of logic by substituting for them problems in linguistics was not based on any very just appreciation of the nature of language, because I should see that, of two synonymous verbal expressions, he was assuming that one really improperly means the thing for which it stands, while the other means this only for the insufficient reason that the person who uses it means that by it. All of which is very disputable. Rather than approve such errors, I should prefer to leave the matter where I have left it. To say that these two statements, the statement that history is an autonomous science and that the statement that rational activity is free, in the sense described, are not synonymous forms of words, but express discoveries, neither of which can be made without making the other. And arising out of this, I will observe that the free will controversy, which was so prominent in the 17th century, had a close connection with the fact that the 17th century was the time when scissors and paste history in its simpler forms was beginning to dissatisfy people, and when historians were beginning to see that their own house needed setting in order, or that historical studies ought to take example from the study of nature and raise themselves to the level of a science. The desire to envisage human action as free was bound up with the desire to achieve autonomy for history as the study of human action. But I do not leave the matter there, because I wish to point out that of the two statements I am considering, one is necessarily prior to the other. It is only by using historical methods that we can find out anything about the objects of historical study. No one will assert that he knows more than historians do about certain actions done in the past concerning which historians claim to have knowledge, and that he knows this in such a way that he can satisfy both himself and other people that that claim is groundless. It follows that we must first achieve a genuinely scientific and therefore autonomous method in historical study before we can grasp the fact that human activity is free. This may seem contrary to facts, for surely, it will be said, many people were already aware that human activity is free, long before that revolution took place by which history raised itself to the level of a science. To this objection I will offer two answers, not mutually exclusive, but the one relatively superficial, the other I hope a little more profound. First, they were aware perhaps of human freedom, but did they grasp it? Was their awareness a knowledge that deserved the name of scientific? Surely not. For in that case they would not only have been convinced of it, they would have known it in a systematic way, and there would have been no room for controversy about it, because those who were convinced of it would have understood the grounds of their conviction and been able to state them convincingly. 2. Even if the revolution by which history has become a science is only about a half-century old, we must not be deceived by the word revolution. Long before Francis Bacon and René Descartes revolutionized natural science by expounding publicly the principles on which its method was based, people here and there had been using these same methods, some more often, some more rarely. As Bacon and Descartes so justly pointed out, the effect of their own work was to put these same methods within the grasp of quite ordinary intellects. When it is said that the methods of history have been revolutionized in the last half-century, this is what is meant. It is not meant that examples of scientific history will be sought in vain before that date. It is meant that, whereas earlier scientific history was a thing of rare occurrence, hardly to be found except in the work of outstanding men, and even them marking moments of inspiration rather than even tenor of study, it is now a thing within the compass of everyone, a thing which we demand of everybody who writes history at all, and which is widely enough understood, even among the unlearned, to procure a livelihood for writers of detective stories whose plot is based upon its methods. The sporadic and intermittent way in which the truth of human freedom was grasped in the 17th century might, to say the least of it, have been a consequence of this sporadic and intermittent grasp on the method of scientific history.